The morning Claudette Voss Hargrove decided to end Clifford Hargrove's life as he knew it, she chose a Tuesday. Not a Friday when the weight of the week might have softened her. Not a Sunday when the light through the kitchen windows came in gold and slow and made everything feel more forgiving than it was. A Tuesday because Claudette was a woman who believed in efficiency, and Tuesdays had no sentiment attached to them. They were work days. They were for getting things done. Cliff was at the kitchen table when she came downstairs. He had been up since 5 the way he had been up since 5 every morning for the last 50 years. First because the railroad demanded it of men who worked its yards. Then because the body learns its habits and does not unlearn them just because the reason is gone. He had made coffee in the old percolator he had brought from his own house 8 years ago, the one Claudette had tried to replace twice with a machine that used pods and cost more than a week of groceries. Both times he had quietly moved the pod machine to a cabinet and put the percolator back on the counter. Both times she had said nothing because there were battles she chose and battles she did not, and the percolator had not been worth the energy. Not yet. He was reading the newspaper, an actual newspaper, the kind that arrived folded on the porch at 6 in the morning because Cliff had subscribed to the Boise Statesman for 31 years and saw no reason to stop. He read it the way he read everything, slowly and completely, starting at the front page and working through to the back, including the obituaries which he had started reading more carefully in the last decade, not out of morbidity but out of a kind of respectful attention. These were people. They had lived. The least a man could do was read their names. He heard Claudette on the stairs before he saw her. She had a particular way of descending, each step placed with deliberate weight, the way a person moves when they have already decided something and is simply traveling toward the moment of saying it. He had noticed this quality in her over the years and had never liked it. Nadine had moved through the house the way water moves, following the natural shape of things, finding the easiest path. Claudette moved like a woman with an agenda, which was because she almost always had one. She came into the kitchen wearing a charcoal blazer over dark jeans, already dressed for the office at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday, her hair pulled back in the style she wore when she had client meetings. She poured herself coffee from the percolator without acknowledging that it was the percolator and not the pod machine which told him something. When Claudette was preparing to say something difficult, she avoided small provocations. She was saving her energy. She sat down across from him at the kitchen table. Not at the end where she usually sat with her laptop and her listings and her phone, but directly across from him, the way people sit when they want to look at you. He folded the newspaper and set it down. He waited. "Cliff," she said, "Merritt and I need to talk to you about something." She had stopped calling him Dad about a year after Nadine died. He had noticed. He had not mentioned it. He looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup. "Merritt's not up yet. He has an early showing. He'll be gone by 7:30. This is actually something I wanted to discuss with you directly." The coffee was good. He had made it strong the way Walter had taught him enough grounds to make the spoon stand up if you let it. He took another sip and set the cup down and folded his hands on the table. The hands of a man who had worked with them for most of his life, thick through the knuckles, permanently stained at the creases from years in the rail yards before he moved into logistics. He looked at Claudette and waited. "We've been talking," she said, and the "we" landed with particular weight because it was the "we" that excluded him. The "we" of Merritt and Claudette as a unit that had somewhere along the line stopped including Cliff in its considerations. "We've been talking about the house, about space, about what we need going forward." He said nothing. Merritt has been offered a partnership at the firm. She said this with pride, and the pride was real, which was the complicated thing about Claudette. She did love Merritt. In her way, in the transactional architecture of how she organized her affections, she loved him. The promotion meant more clients, more hours, more business entertaining. "We're going to need the spare room for a home office, a proper one. We've already talked to a designer about built-in shelving, a proper desk setup." The spare room. He had been sleeping in the spare room for 3 years since Nadine's diagnosis had made the stairs difficult, and they had moved a hospital bed into what had been the guest room on the main floor. And then after she was gone, he had simply stayed there, because the room he had shared with her for 46 years was upstairs, and going back to it felt like something he was not yet ready to do. He still was not ready. He was not sure he would ever be ready. He looked at her. He kept his face still. He had learned this from Walter, who had spent 41 years working with men who would take any visible weakness and use it not out of cruelty, but out of the nature of men who work hard in difficult places, and have learned that stillness is a form of strength. I see, he said. We think it's time, Cliff. You've been here 8 years. You're settled. You know the area. There are some very nice senior communities in the valley, and with your Social Security and your pension from the rail work. He held up one hand just slightly and she stopped. How long, he said. She blinked. I'm sorry. How long are you giving me? She set her coffee cup down. We were thinking by the end of the week. Friday. The movers can come Saturday morning. 4 days. We've been very patient, Cliff. The word patient dropped into the kitchen like something thrown from a height. He looked at it lying there on the table between them. Patient. As though he had been a house guest who had overstayed a welcome he had never actually been extended. As though the $218,000 he had handed to Merritt 8 years ago, every dollar from the sale of the house on Caldwell Street, where Merritt had grown up and where Nadine had planted the rose garden, that still came back every spring, had been a loan rather than a gift. As though the 8 years of cooking and yard work and watching Nadine's health decline in a house that had never felt like his had been a kind of debt being paid. He thought about saying some of this. He considered it seriously the way he considered most things. Then he picked up his coffee cup and finished what was in it and stood up from the table. I'll be out by Friday, he said. She looked surprised. She had prepared for an argument, and the absence of one seemed to unsettle her in a way she did not quite know what to do with. Cliff, I want you to know this isn't personal. He picked up the newspaper. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she dropped her eyes first. It's all right, Claudette, he said. You take care of yourself. He went upstairs to start packing. The room was small as spare rooms go. He had not accumulated much in 8 years here, partly because there had not been room, and partly because he was not a man who accumulated. Walter had raised him in a house where everything had a purpose, and things without purposes did not last long. You kept what you needed. You maintained what you kept. You did not collect sentiment in the form of objects because objects broke and were lost and were stolen and were left behind when the time came to leave, as the time always came. And what was inside you was what you carried with you regardless. He had 2 bags. A rolling suitcase from a set he and Nadine had bought for their 40th anniversary trip to the Oregon coast. The trip where she had insisted on eating clam chowder every single day because she said you could only be on the coast once in your life, even if you went back 100 times. The suitcase was dark green with a small brass buckle on the outer pocket that had been loose for 3 years and which he had never gotten around to fixing. He fixed it now with a small screwdriver from the kit he kept in his nightstand, taking his time doing it properly, because that was how Walter had taught him to approach any task that was worth doing at all. The second bag was a duffel olive green Army surplus, bought in 1978 and still sound. Into the duffel went his clothes folded the way Nadine had taught him after years of what she called his criminal approach to laundry. Into the suitcase went the box of photographs. Nadine at 22 in a yellow dress at the state fair, laughing at something off camera, her whole face lit. Walter in his engineer's cap on the last day he ran the main line route, standing in front of the locomotive with one hand on the wheel, housing and the grin of a man who had done the thing he was put on earth to do. Merritt at 7 holding a fish almost as long as his arm on the lake trip they had taken the summer before Walter's diagnosis. Cliff and Nadine on their 25th anniversary, standing in front of the house on Caldwell Street, looking at the camera with the particular expression of people who believe they are permanent. He did not take the furniture. There was not much to take that was his. The percolator, the newspaper, the small wooden box that had been his father's, the one that had sat on Walter's dresser for as long as Cliff could remember and had come to him when Walter died in 2005, along with the contents, a brass key on a leather cord, old and unremarkable. The kind of key that might belong to a lockbox or a strongbox, or nothing at all. Walter had pressed it into Cliff's hand 2 days before the end, when the morphine had mostly taken him, but there were still hours of clarity that came and went like breaks in weather. "Keep this," Walter had said. His voice by then was very quiet, a man talking from somewhere far inside himself. "When the time comes, you'll know what it's for." Cliff had not known what it was for. He had put it in the wooden box and put the wooden box in his nightstand and carried it with him from Caldwell Street to this house 8 years ago, the same way he had carried the percolator and the newspaper subscription and the photograph of Nadine in the yellow dress. Some things you carry not because you understand them, but because they were given to you by someone whose judgment you trusted. He took the key out of the box and held it in his palm. It was brass worn smooth on the shaft, from decades of handling the bow, a simple oval with a small ridge cut into the top. The bit was unusual, a double-cut pattern he did not recognize. He had shown it to a locksmith once, years ago, out of idle curiosity. The man had looked at it and said it was a cabinet key, old-style pre-war probably, and that without the cabinet it opened there was no way to know much more than that. He put it on the leather cord Walter had kept it on and hung it around his neck under his shirt. He did not examine the decision. It felt correct, and he had learned to trust that feeling. The 4 days passed in a kind of suspended quiet. Claudette went to work each morning and came home each evening, and they moved around each other in the house like two weather systems that had agreed not to interact. Merritt was home for dinner on Wednesday, but ate quickly and took his phone into the living room afterward, and Cliff did not try to manufacture a conversation. He had spent 8 years in this house, watching his son drift in the direction Claudette pointed him, and he was tired of watching it the same way you could be tired of watching water run downhill. It was not anyone's fault. It was simply the nature of things. On Wednesday evening, he called Sullivan Greaves, who had been his father's friend before he became his own, and told him what was happening. Sullivan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Where are you going to go, Cliff?" "I've been thinking about that," Cliff said. "You remember what my father used to say about the land out near Callaway Creek?" Another silence. "Lord Almighty, he actually bought it. He bought it in 1981. 6 acres off the old rail right-of-way. There's a Pullman car out there. He had it towed when the Northern Pacific was scrapping the old fleet. He always said he'd fix it up someday. You're not seriously thinking about going out there?" "It's mine," Cliff said. "The property taxes have been coming to me for 20 years. I've been paying them. It's mine. Cliff, there's nothing out there. It's high desert scrub. The car's been sitting for 40 years. Then it needs work," Cliff said. "I've done work before." There was a pause, and then Sullivan made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Your father," he said. "God help you, you are exactly your father." On Thursday night, Cliff could not sleep. This was not unusual. He had slept poorly for 3 years since the night Nadine had been taken to the hospital and had not come home, or had come home, but not in any way that meant what home had always meant. The body gets accustomed to the weight of another person in the bed beside it. The absence of that weight is a presence of its own, a specific shape of empty space, and it does not go away. He lay on the narrow spare room bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the house. Houses talk at night. Any man who has lived in enough of them knows this. The structure contracting in the cold. The pipes in the walls carrying water to some ordinary middle-of-the-night purpose. The particular silence that settles over a house after midnight when everyone in it has finally stopped moving. Somewhere around 2 in the morning he heard voices from downstairs. Not loud. Murmured, the kind of sound that carries not because of volume, but because a house at 2 in the morning amplifies anything that moves through it. He lay still and listened and could not make out words. He got up. He was a man who had spent his working life in environments where situational awareness was a survival skill. The rail yards at night were loud and dark and full of machinery that could kill you if you were not paying attention to where it was and where it was going. He had learned to move quietly and to read the meaning of sounds before he understood their source. He pulled on his flannel shirt and moved down the hall to the top of the stairs and stood there in the dark. Merritt and Claudette were in the kitchen. The light over the stove was on the low one they used when they did not want to wake each other but needed enough light to see by. Claudette was on the phone. Her voice was low and deliberate, the voice she used in professional negotiations, and Merritt was sitting at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the surface the way he sat when he was nervous. The call had a speakerphone quality, a slight hollow distance, that told Cliff there was a third voice in the room coming through the device in Claudette's hand. The name he heard was Derek Ashford. He had heard this name before at the edges of conversations he had not been part of in the tone people use when they are referring to someone who is delivering something they want. An investment contact, a development opportunity, a man who knew people who knew how to move money in ways that produced returns ordinary channels did not. He stood at the top of the stairs and listened. The conversation was about the house, about the equity in it, which had grown substantially in 8 years because Boise real estate had done in that time what Boise real estate did, which was increase. The refinancing numbers Claudette was discussing were specific. The amount she mentioned was $140,000. The phrase she used for the destination of that money was Coeur d'Alene development opportunity. The timeline she was discussing with the voice on the phone was contingent on one thing: the spare room being cleared by the end of the week. Once the old man's out, Merritt said, his voice so flat and careful it might have belonged to someone Cliff did not recognize, "We can move on the application right away." Cliff stood at the top of the stairs for a long time after that. He did not feel what he expected to feel. He had braced himself against rage, the hot, clarifying anger of a man who has been betrayed by his own blood, and the anger did not come, or did not come in the form he expected. What came instead was something quieter and in some ways worse. It was the feeling of a door closing, the specific sound of it, the small definitive click of a mechanism engaging a thing that had been open becoming shut. He thought about going down the stairs. He thought about walking into the kitchen and sitting down at the table and saying the things that could be said, the true things, the things he had been politely not saying for 8 years. He stood at the top of the stairs and considered it carefully, the way Walter had taught him to consider things that could not be undone once done. Then he went back to the spare room. He opened the nightstand drawer and took out the wooden box and opened it and looked at the key inside the brass key on the leather cord that Walter had pressed into his hand 19 years ago. He took it out of the box and put it around his neck under his shirt and lay down on the narrow bed and closed his eyes. He did not sleep, but he lay still, which is its own kind of rest, and when the sky outside the window began to lighten, he got up and made coffee and read the newspaper one last time at the kitchen table alone before anyone else came down. Friday came gray and cold for October in Boise. He was dressed and packed before 6. He carried the 2 bags and the percolator down to the front hall and set them there. He ate toast standing at the kitchen counter and drank his coffee and rinsed the cup and dried it and put it in the duffel because it was his cup and he was not leaving it. Claudette came downstairs at 7 wearing workout clothes already planned for a morning that had moved past him before he had finished being in it. "Do you have somewhere to go?" she said. He picked up the rolling suitcase. He picked up the duffel. He set the percolator on top of the suitcase. "I do," he said. She held the front door open. He stepped past her onto the porch. The morning air was cold in the particular way of high desert mornings in October, clean and sharp and indifferent. The neighbor across the street was scraping frost off his windshield and looked up and then looked away. "Cliff," she said behind him, "I want you to know this wasn't personal." He stopped on the front walk. He did not turn around. He stood for a moment with the weight of the bags in his hands and the morning cold on his face and the key against his chest under his shirt, and then he started walking. He walked 4 blocks to the Greyhound station. He had looked up the schedule the night before. The bus to Callaway Creek, Eastern Oregon, departed at 9:40, made the run in 3 hours and change, with stops at every town along the way that was big enough to have a gas station and a general store. The ticket cost $22. He sat in the waiting area with his bags between his feet and the duffel on his lap, and a cup of vending machine coffee that was terrible in every way that mattered to a man who had made his own for 50 years. He drank it anyway because there was nothing to do but wait, and having something in your hands makes waiting easier. He thought about Nadine. He thought about her the way he thought about her every day, not as a wound, but as a compass, the way you think about the person whose judgment was better than your own. Nadine would have laughed, he thought. Not cruelly. She would have laughed the way she laughed at things that were absurd but true, with a particular delight she had for the universe presenting you with exactly the thing you had not seen coming. She would have said something that made it funny, and then she would have said something that made it right. And then she would have told him exactly what to do, and she would have been correct. He did not know exactly what to do. He knew where he was going, which was a start. The bus pulled out at 9:52, 12 minutes late, which was about average in his experience. He sat by the window and watched Boise give way to the suburbs, and the suburbs give way to the particular flatness of the high desert, the sage and the bitterbrush and the volcanic rock, and the long distances between things that define the landscape east of the Cascades. He had always loved this country. Walter had loved it too, the way men love places that do not flatter you but tell you the truth. He thought about Walter. Walter Hargrove had worked for the Union Pacific for 41 years, starting as a brakeman at 20 and retiring as a senior locomotive engineer at 61. He was a quiet man with heavy hands and a precision about everything he did that came from decades of working in conditions where imprecision could kill you or the man beside you. He had taught Cliff to read land the way other fathers taught their sons to read box scores. He had taught him to listen to machinery the way a doctor listens to a body attentively, without assumption, waiting for the sound that told you what the thing was doing and whether it was healthy. He had taught him that patience was not passive, that waiting for the right moment was itself a form of work, and that most of the mistakes men made came from moving before the time was right. He had said very little about the land at Callaway Creek over the years. A mention here and there, the way you mention something you are holding in reserve. When the railroads sold off the old right-of-way parcels in 1981, Walter had bought 6 acres for almost nothing. The kind of price that in those days you could get for land that had no road access and no water and sat at the end of a dirt track 3 miles from anything that could be called a town. He had paid a flatbed crew out of his own pocket to haul the Pullman car out there, a 1947 heavyweight from the old Northern Pacific Fleet, pulled from service in the late 60s and sitting in a rail yard going to rust. He loved that car, Cliff knew. The way men of Walter's generation love things they had built their lives around. He had talked about retiring out there, fixing the car up, living simply in the high desert, with the pines and the hawks and the long silences that a man who had spent his career in the noise of rail yards might find restorative. He had never done it. His health had declined faster than he planned, and then the planning stopped because you reach a point where planning is no longer the appropriate activity. The bus stopped in Ontario, in Vail, in Nissa. In each small town, Cliff watched the landscape through the window, the sky opening wider as they moved east, the mountains receding, the country becoming the kind of country where you could see weather coming from 30 miles away and had time to decide what you were going to do about it. Callaway Creek was barely a town. He had known this in the abstract, but the reality of it arrived as the bus pulled off the highway onto a county road and dropped him on the shoulder next to a rusted sign that said, Callaway Creek Pop. 340, the population number, hand-corrected in faded paint from whatever it had been before, which had also been a small number. There was a gas station with 2 pumps, a general store with a hand-painted sign over the door that said, Fitch Provisions, a post office the size of a garden shed, a bar called the Ridgeline Dark at this hour, a grain elevator at the end of the main street, its roof patched with corrugated tin. Beyond all of it, the land going away in every direction toward hills covered in western juniper and ponderosa pine. The sky above them enormous and pale blue and completely indifferent. He picked up his bags and the percolator and went into Fitch Provisions. The woman behind the counter was in her 60s, iron-haired, with the face of someone who had spent most of their life outdoors in the eyes of someone who noticed things. A nameplate on the counter said Norma. She was sorting mail into a grid of wooden cubbyholes behind the register, and she looked up when the door opened with the direct, uncurious gaze of a woman who had seen most of what there was to see in a place this size, and was rarely surprised by new arrivals, but noted them nonetheless. "I'm looking for the old Hargrove property," Cliff said. "My father owned a piece of land out past the cattle grade on Power Line Road. There's an old rail car on it." She stopped sorting mail. She looked at him with the particular attention of someone updating their understanding of something. "Walter Hargrove's boy," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am. Your dad used to come out here once in a while. Years back. Quiet man, bought coffee and dry goods and didn't say much." "That sounds right." She looked at his bags, at the percolator sitting on top of the suitcase. She looked at him with the measuring patience of a woman who has learned that the most useful thing you can do for a person in a difficult situation is give them exactly what they need and nothing they did not ask for. "You walking out there, I am." She nodded slowly, the nod of a woman processing information and deciding what to do with it. She reached under the counter and came up with a piece of paper and a pen and wrote down the directions in large, clear letters and slid it across to him. "3 miles out Power Line Road past the cattle grate. You'll see the gate on the left. Gate'll be hanging probably. The car's back from the roadaways." He took the directions. He bought a half loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter and a flashlight and 2 gallons of water because 3 miles in October high desert with bags was going to take a while, and he was 74 years old and not entirely foolish about it. When he put the money on the counter, Norma slid $1 back without explanation, and he understood enough about small-town generosity to simply take it. The walk took almost 2 hours. The dirt road was rutted, and the afternoon was going toward cold by the time he started, the sun already lower than he would have liked, the shadows of the junipers long across the road. His left knee, which had been troubling him since a fall 3 years ago, reminded him of itself around the first mile and was insistent about it by the second. He stopped every 15 minutes and set the bags down and let his hands recover from the weight and his knee recover from the road and looked at the country around him. It was beautiful in the way that land is beautiful when it does not care whether you find it so. Juniper and sage and bitterbrush on both sides, a red-tailed hawk, working the thermals above the ridge to the east, riding the air with the unhurried authority of a creature that has never needed to be anywhere in particular. The smell of the land itself, dry and resinous. The particular scent of high desert in October, when the summer heat has finally burned off, and what's left is the smell of the thing underneath the earth and the rock and the roots of things that live through winters by going very deep. He was thinking about Walter when he came around the last bend in the road and saw the property. He stopped walking. The gate was hanging from one hinge as Norma had said it would be. The fence on either side of it was barbed wire, half collapsed in places, the posts leaning with the patient determination of things that have been leaning for a long time and have made their peace with it. Inside the fence, 6 acres of overgrown high desert, scrub cheat grass and bitterbrush, and a few young pines that had volunteered themselves into what must once have been a clearing. The clearing itself was still visible in outline, the shape of where a man had once had plans, the ghost of an intention that had outlasted the man. And in the middle of it, sitting on a short section of weed-grown track that ran maybe 40 feet in each direction before ending in nothing, was the Pullman car. It was a 1947 heavyweight. He knew this from the shape of it, long and low and solid, the kind of railroad car built in the era when they built things to last rather than to be replaced. The paint had faded from whatever dark green it had once been to the color of old moss, a color that had stopped being a color and become a texture. The lettering along the side was mostly gone, just the ghost of letters in a different shade of faded. Rust had colonized the roof in long brown streaks that ran down the sides like the marks of old weeping. The windows were dirty and 2 of them were broken. Vines had climbed the wheels. The vestibule door at the near end was closed and padlocked with a brass lock. He set his bags down in the dirt. He stood there and looked at the car and at the wild and overgrown land around it and at the shadows that were now reaching all the way across the clearing and climbing the far side of the car. He stood there for a long time. He had spent 8 years making himself useful in a house that had never been his. He had cooked and maintained and accommodated and tried in every way available to him to justify the space he took up in a life that was not his own. He had watched Nadine decline and had sat beside her and had held her hand at the end and had then continued to sit in the spare room of the house they had bought with the money from the sale of everything he and Nadine had built, because there was nowhere else to be, and because Merritt was there, and because Nadine would have wanted him to try. He had tried. He had tried for 3 years after she was gone, and what he had gotten for it was a Tuesday morning in 4 days, and the sound of his son's voice at 2 in the morning saying, "Once the old man's out." He looked at the Pullman car. He looked at the key on the cord around his neck, which he had pulled out of his shirt during the walk without quite deciding to. He picked up his bags. He walked through the hanging gate and across the overgrown clearing to the vestibule door. He looked at the brass padlock. It was heavily corroded green-brown at the edges, the kind of corrosion that comes from decades of weather and no attention. He tried pulling it, and it did not come. He tried turning the shackle, and it did not move. He put the key in. It went in easily, the way a key goes into a lock it was made for, with that specific small resistance of a mechanism that recognizes what belongs in it. He turned it. The lock did not open. He stood there with the key in the lock and tried again more carefully, and the lock still did not open, and he understood that this was the wrong lock or the wrong key or both, and that whatever the key opened was somewhere inside the car. He worked his way along the side of the car and found the service door a side entrance that had been pried open at some point, the metal bent outward, the latch hanging useless. He put his shoulder against it and pushed. It groaned and gave an inch. He pushed again, steadying himself against the car's body with his other hand, and it scraped open just wide enough for him to squeeze through. The smell hit him first, mildew and dust, and beneath those sweeter and older, the smell of the materials the car had been built from, varnished wood and treated leather and something mineral he could not name, the smell of things built to last that had lasted even in neglect. He clicked on the flashlight. The interior of the Pullman was both worse and better than he had expected. Worse because the years had been hard on the soft materials, the velvet bench seats cracked and splitting the stuffing, coming out in places, pine needles and rodent leavings thick on the floor, cobwebs hanging from the ceiling like gray curtains. Better because the bones were exactly what Sullivan had told him Walter used to say they were good. The brass fittings on the window frames oxidized green but intact. The luggage racks still bolted firmly to the walls. The paneled ceiling still in place, its varnish gone, but the wood sound. The structural frame of the car visible in the places where the lining had given way, and it was uncompromised solid, built to carry the weight of the world at speed, and built to do it for decades. At the far end, a small door that had once led to the porter's compartment. He swept the worst of the debris off 2 bench seats and set his bags down. He set the percolator on the luggage rack. He arranged himself on the bench with his coat over him and his duffel as a pillow and the flashlight propped against the window frame. He looked at the curved ceiling of the Pullman in the fading light. He thought about what Walter used to say when things were hard, which was not often because Walter was not a man given to commentary on difficulty. He said it once that Cliff could remember when the rail yard had a bad accident and a man Cliff knew had been badly hurt, and Cliff had come home shaken in a way he could not properly account for. Walter had sat with him at the kitchen table for a while without speaking, and then he had said, "You stay in it, Clifford. That's all you do. You stay in it until you can see what comes next." He stayed in it. Outside, the wind moved through the junipers and the temperature dropped and something called from a long way off in the dark. He lay on the bench seat of his father's Pullman car on his father's land and watched the last of the day leave the sky through the dirty windows. He did not know yet what was in the car. He did not know yet what the key opened. He did not know what came next. But the land was his. The car was his. Whatever was inside it had been put there by a man who had spent 41 years running locomotives through weather and dark and difficulty, with his hands on the controls and his eyes on the track ahead. A man who had always planned further ahead than anyone around him knew. He closed his eyes. He was 74 years old and he had nowhere to be in the morning and nothing to lose. And he was for the first time in a very long time in a place that belonged entirely to him. He slept. The first light came in through the east-facing windows. the color of weak tea, thin and horizontal, the kind of light that does not yet commit to anything but makes its presence known. Cliff was already awake when it arrived. He had slept in 3-hour intervals the way he had slept for years. The body's internal architecture rearranged by age and loss into something that no longer believed in the long, uninterrupted dark. He lay on the bench seat and listened to the Pullman settle around him in the morning cold, the metal contracting, the wood speaking in its own slow language. And he thought that any building sounds different when someone is living in it versus when it has been empty. The car had been empty for decades. It was beginning to understand that something had changed. He sat up. His back said what backs say to men of 74 who have slept on bench seats. But it said it without real conviction, the complaint of a body that has learned to function through discomfort and expects to keep doing so. He pulled his coat on. He laced his boots with the careful deliberateness he brought to everything. He stepped outside through the service door into an October morning that was 38 degrees and smelled of frost and pine resin and the distant smoke of someone's wood stove 3 valleys over. He stood on the ground beside the Pullman and looked at the sky. It was enormous out here the way it was enormous in all high desert country. The kind of sky that makes you understand why the people who settled this land were either broken by it or changed into something larger by the encounter. No buildings to interrupt the sightline, no traffic noise, just the juniper and the sage and a red-tailed hawk already riding the thermals above the eastern ridge, and the sky going from pale gray to the particular blue that belongs to mornings before the sun is fully committed. He made a list in his mind the way Walter had taught him, because a man without a list is a man without direction, and a man without direction gets things done in the wrong order and wastes the morning. First, water. Second, assess the property properly in daylight. Third, figure out the lock situation on the vestibule door and what was inside the car. Everything else would follow from those 3 things in that order. He walked the perimeter of the 6 acres before breakfast. The fence was salvageable on 2 sides and would need to be replaced on the other 2, the posts having given up their purchase in the rocky soil over the decades, and the wire rusted through in enough places that it was decorative rather than functional. The clearing at the center of the property was overgrown, but not impossibly so. Under the cheatgrass and bitterbrush, he could see the shapes of what had once been organized space. The ghost of intention, the kind of order that comes back if you're willing to do the work of uncovering it. There was a natural drainage line along the north side of the property that told him where a well might find water if he drilled in the right place. Walter had understood land. He had chosen this parcel for reasons, and the reasons were still visible to a man who knew how to look. The Pullman itself in full morning light was both more daunting and more promising than it had seemed in the dusk of the previous afternoon. More daunting because the extent of the neglect was now fully visible. The rust on the roof widespread the broken windows, a more serious problem for weatherproofing than he had initially assessed the vines at the wheel trucks, having worked their way into the undercarriage in ways that would take time and effort to address. More promising because the car's fundamental structure was, as Sullivan had relayed Walter's assessment across all those years, genuinely good. The body was straight. The roof under the rust was intact steel. The floor, what he could see of it through the debris and the rodent damage, was original hardwood laid over a steel subfloor that had not warped or shifted despite 40 years of neglect. The bones were good. Everything else was cosmetic, which meant everything else was workable. He ate bread and peanut butter standing at the service door and drank water from one of the gallon jugs and considered the problem of the vestibule door. The brass padlock was the primary issue, the corroded external lock that the key around his neck did not open. He could cut it. He needed bolt cutters for that which he did not have, which meant either a trip to Callaway Creek or waiting until someone came by with tools. He tried the lock again in the morning light, examining it more carefully, and noticed something he had not seen the previous evening. The lock was not the original lock. The hasp it hung on was newer steel, the kind of hardware store replacement fitting you could buy at any Ace or True Value, chrome-plated rather than brass, the chrome gone to a dull gray but structurally more recent than anything else on the car. Someone had replaced the original lock at some point, probably decades ago, but well after the car had been placed here. Walter. Walter had replaced the original lock, which meant Walter had been back here after the car was placed, which meant there was something inside the car that Walter had decided needed securing after the initial placement, something that needed a different lock than the one the car had come with, and whatever that something was, it was still in there. He walked the 3 miles back to Callaway Creek. Norma Fitch was opening the store when he got there, pulling the front door back against a rubber doorstop and straightening the sign in the window that listed the daily hours. She looked at him without surprise, the look of a woman who had made certain predictions the previous afternoon and was now watching them confirmed. "You made it out there," she said. "I did." "How bad is it?" He considered. "Bad enough. Good enough." She nodded at that, the way people nod when something confirms what they already knew. He bought bolt cutters and a good broom and 3 gallons of water and a camp stove and 2 canisters of propane and a bag of oatmeal and more bread and more peanut butter and coffee, actual coffee, the pre-ground kind, in a can that would work in the percolator. If he could get the percolator working without electricity, which he could, because it was a stovetop model and had never needed anything but heat. He bought work gloves and a box of contractor-grade garbage bags and a coil of utility rope and a tarp. Norma added up the total and looked at it and looked at him and then adjusted 2 of the line items without comment. He paid what she asked and did not argue and carried everything out to the road and began the walk back. The second walk was harder than the first because of the weight, but he had configured it better, the heavy items in the duffel worn on his back, the rest in bags distributed between both hands, and he stopped more frequently and took his time and used the stops to look at the land rather than fighting the inconvenience of them. He was almost back to the gate when the pickup truck came up behind him. It was an old F-150 mid-90s. The red faded to the color of old brick, with a rail worker's toolbox in the bed and a crack in the passenger side windshield that had been there long enough to develop a secondary crack running perpendicular. The truck slowed when it came alongside him, and the window came down, and a man looked out. He was in his early 70s, white mustache, a Union Pacific cap on his head, with the kind of sweat stain on the brim that comes from decades of actual use. He looked at Cliff with the measuring assessment of a man who spent his working life reading situations quickly and had not lost the habit in retirement. "You Walter Hargrove's boy," he said. The question landed with a weight that Cliff had not expected. He had been called Walter Hargrove's boy his entire life, and it had never struck him as anything but ordinary. Out here at this particular moment, carrying bolt cutters and a camp stove and a coil of rope 3 miles down a dirt road in eastern Oregon, it struck him as something else entirely. It struck him as an answer to a question he had not known he was asking. "I am," he said. The man looked at him, looked at the bags in the toolbox and the bolt cutters. He put the truck in park. "Leonard Briggs," he said, "I worked the UP with your father for 31 years. Retired out of the Pocatello yard in 2009. Got a place up the road from here about 4 miles. Norma's sister called me this morning and told me Walter Hargrove's son had come out to the old property." Norma Cliff said. "Big family, small town," Leonard said. He opened the truck door and got out. He was a shade under 6 feet and moved with the deliberate economy of men who have used their bodies hard for decades and have learned to be precise about it. He looked at the bolt cutters in Cliff's bag and nodded at them. "Vestibule door," he said. "Locks corroded," Cliff said. Leonard reached into the truck bed and came up with a can of penetrating oil. "Your dad showed me this car once back in 2002 or so. Last time he came out here that I know of. He brought me out on a Saturday and we walked the property and he showed me what he'd been building and what he was planning. He was quiet about most of it the way he was quiet about most things. But he said something before we left that I have thought about a number of times since." He looked at Cliff steadily. He said, "Leonard, I put something inside this car for my boy. He'll come for it when he needs it. Said the key would tell him when the time was right." Cliff did not say anything. Leonard looked at the key on the cord around Cliff's neck. He nodded once without drama, the way men nod when they have been waiting a long time for a thing to make sense, and it finally has. "Let's go open that door," he said. They rode the last quarter mile in the truck. Leonard walked the length of the Pullman the way Cliff had walked it the previous evening, one hand trailing along the side of the car, reading the metal under his fingers. He made sounds of assessment under his breath, not words exactly, just the sounds a man makes when he is updating his understanding of a situation. He sprayed penetrating oil on the hasp fitting and on the padlock shackle and gave it 5 minutes while they drank coffee from a thermos Leonard had brought. Then he took the bolt cutters from Cliff's bag and cut the external padlock in one clean motion, the corroded brass dropping into the dirt with a flat, dead sound. He handed Cliff the bolt cutters and stepped back. The vestibule door was Cliff's to open. It was stiff from disuse, the hinges protesting the door itself, slightly warped at the bottom, where moisture had gotten into the frame. Cliff worked it with steady pressure, not forcing it, feeling for the point at which force became useful rather than counterproductive. And after a minute of careful effort, the door swung open onto the vestibule platform. The original iron step still solid underfoot, the handrail still present, though loose in its mounting. Leonard looked at the door. "Front door on a Pullman is the proper way in," he said. "Your father always said that. Side doors for the crew." Cliff looked at the open vestibule door and the interior of the car visible beyond it. Leonard put his cap back on. "I'll come back in a few days. Bring my wife, Dorothy. She'd skin me if she knew I'd found Walter's boy and hadn't brought her." He looked at the property. "Your father built something good out here, Cliff. Something worth the work." He shook Cliff's hand. The handshake of men who have done physical work, full grip brief, meaning more than ceremony. He got in the truck and drove back down the dirt road, and the sound of the engine faded into the distance, and Cliff was alone with the open door. He did not go in through the vestibule immediately. He went in through the service door as he had the night before, and got the camp stove set up on one of the luggage racks and got the percolator going with water from the gallon jugs. He made coffee and drank it, standing in the middle of the car in the morning light that was now coming through the east-facing windows, which he had wiped down with a damp rag cleaner than they had been in years, though still not what you would call transparent. Then he got the broom, and he went to work. He started at the vestibule end and worked toward the porter's compartment at the far end, sweeping in long strokes the accumulated debris of decades' pine needles and rodent droppings, and the dry casings of things that had lived and died in here dust, so old it had become a kind of sediment. He worked steadily and without hurry, the way Walter had shown him to approach any job of meaningful size, not racing toward completion, but maintaining the pace that could be sustained for hours without degrading into exhaustion or sloppiness. He swept. He bagged what he swept. He carried the bags out through the vestibule door, the proper door, the front door, and stacked them at the edge of the clearing to be burned later. He came back. He swept again. By early afternoon, the floor was clear enough to walk without watching where you stepped. The smell of the car had changed from the thick closeness of undisturbed decay to something cleaner, still old. Still the smell of materials that had been here for a very long time, but breathable in a way it had not been. He could hear the structural sounds of the car more clearly now, the particular resonance of steel and wood that had, under all the neglect, retained the quality of its original construction. He ate lunch sitting on the vestibule steps, bread and peanut butter, and the last of the morning's coffee cold now. A Clark's nutcracker landed on the fence post nearest the gate and regarded him with the direct mercenary interest birds bring to the presence of humans eating. He thought about Walter. He thought about Walter specifically in 2002, bringing Leonard out here, walking this property, saying what he had said. Walter would have been 69 then, 4 years from his death, 3 years into Merritt's marriage to Claudette. Walter had always been careful about Claudette. Not unkind, not openly critical, but careful in the way he was careful about things that required watching. He had asked questions about her when Merritt first brought her home that were not unfriendly, but were thorough in a way that had made Claudette Cliff had noticed slightly uncomfortable. Walter asked questions that went past the surface. He did not do it to be difficult. He did it because he needed to know what he was dealing with. 3 years into that marriage, Walter had come out here and told Leonard that he had put something inside this car for his boy and that the boy would come for it when he needed it. 3 years into that marriage, Walter had already understood something about the future. The afternoon went into cleaning the windows. He did them one at a time with rags and water, the outside first, working from the vestibule end toward the porter's compartment, along the south side of the car, where the afternoon light was best, then back along the north side. The broken ones he covered with pieces of tarp cut to size and taped over the frames with the heavy utility tape Leonard had left in the truck bed, along with a small box of tools and 3 cans of penetrating oil, the quiet provisions of a man who understood what would be needed and had arranged for it without being asked. The work was slow, and the repetition of it was something he did not fight. He had spent his life in work that was repetitive, the rail yards running on rhythm and sequence, the way all industrial work does, the same operations performed the same way every time, because deviation was where accidents happened. He had learned to find something in repetition that other men called boredom and that he called a form of attention. When your hands know what they are doing, your mind is free to go somewhere useful. His mind went to the question of the key, not the external padlock, which was gone now. The small brass lock on whatever was inside the car that Walter had intended the key to open. He had examined the car through 2 days of cleaning and had not found it, which meant it was not obvious, which was entirely consistent with what he knew of Walter, who had never in his life done the obvious thing when a less obvious thing was more secure. He finished the windows on the south side as the sun was going behind the ridge. He came back inside through the vestibule and looked at the car in the oblique afternoon light, the light coming through the now cleaner windows at the angle that shows you things you have not seen before. The ceiling panels. The car's ceiling was the original vaulted design, a series of flat rectangular panels set into a curved frame, each panel about 18 inches wide and 4 feet long, finished in painted wood that had gone from whatever its original color was to a uniform pale gray over the decades. He counted 16 panels. 15 of them looked exactly alike. The 16th he now noticed in this particular light was slightly different. Third from the vestibule end on the left side of the center seam. It was the same size and the same color as the others. The difference was at one corner where the paint had worn differently than on the surrounding panels. Not from weather, but from contact, the kind of wear that comes from being touched repeatedly in the same place. A fingertip-sized area where the paint was slightly thinner, slightly different in texture. He stood on one of the bench seats and reached up. The panel moved. It slid sideways in its frame an inch, then two, the way a panel slides when it has been designed to slide. Not warped or broken, not a storm-damaged casualty, but deliberately engineered, cut to fit the frame with a tolerance that allowed for this exact movement. He pushed it further, and it came fully open on one side, pivoting on a point he could not see, revealing a cavity in the ceiling frame above. He reached up into the dark space with his hand. His fingers found canvas. Oiled canvas, the waterproof kind used for tool rolls and equipment covers, wrapped around something flat and rectangular, lashed to the structural crossbeam above, with twine that had gone brittle with age but had held. He worked the lashing loose carefully, preserving what he could, and the package came down into his hands heavier than its size suggested. He climbed down from the bench. He set the package on the seat. He stood there looking at it with both hands open at his sides and his heart doing something in his chest that it had not done in years. A kind of suspended percussion, the sound a man's body makes when it understands. Before his mind does that something significant has arrived. He unwrapped the canvas carefully. It was old but intact, the oil treatment having done exactly what oil canvas is designed to do, which is keep what is inside it dry, regardless of what the outside world decides to do with moisture and time. Inside the canvas was a leather satchel, the kind of flat document satchel a man might carry his working papers in. Dark brown leather, old and soft, with years of handling, the kind of quality that outlasts its maker. On the flap, stamped in gold that had faded to a dull whisper of itself, WRH. Walter Raymond Hargrove. Tied to the buckle of the satchel on a short loop of leather cord was a folded piece of paper. He opened it. The handwriting was Walter's block letter, precise the penmanship of a man who had learned to write in an era when penmanship was taught as a form of character. Clifford, if you are reading this, you have found your way here. I am glad. I thought you would, but I was not certain of the timing. The key opens the satchel. There is more inside than you might expect. I meant to tell you all of this in person. I ran out of time. Forgive me for that. Whatever has happened, whatever has brought you here, the land is yours, and what is in this satchel is yours. And nobody can take either of those things from you. I made sure of it. I love you, son. I have always been proud of you. Dad. Cliff sat down on the bench seat. He sat there for a long time with the letter in his hands and the satchel beside him, and the light going out of the windows as the sun fully left the ridge, and the car going from gold to gray around him. He sat there the way a man sits when he has received something that requires him to be still for a while before he can properly receive it. Then he reached into his shirt and pulled out the key on the cord around his neck. The satchel's buckle had a small integrated lock built into the mechanism, the kind of thing you would not notice unless you were looking for it recessed into the brass of the buckle itself, a keyhole barely larger than his thumbnail. He put the key in. He turned it. The mechanism released with a click that was barely audible, but that he felt go through his entire chest. He opened the satchel. The letters were on top, a bundle of them perhaps 20 folded and tied with a piece of red string, the paper aged to the color of old cream. He untied the string and unfolded the top letter. The date was March 14th, 2005, 8 months before Walter died. He read, Clifford, the doctor told me last week what I already knew, which is that we are out of time for treatments and into the business of managing what comes next. I have not told you this yet because I know you. You will change everything about your life to be here, and I do not want that. I have Miriam coming in 3 mornings a week, and I am managing fine for now. What I want to do instead of telling you is write to you. I have things to say that I have not said the way men in our family have always had things we did not say until it was almost too late to say them. I am going to try to do better than that. He read the letter twice. Then he set it carefully on the bench beside him and reached for the next one. He read 4 letters in the fading daylight before he needed the flashlight. He read 3 more by flashlight, sitting on the bench with his coat pulled around him and the temperature in the car dropping as the October night came on. Walter wrote about the day Cliff was born, which he had apparently witnessed more fully than had been the custom for fathers of his generation, having simply refused to leave when the nurse suggested he might want to wait in the hall. He wrote about the morning Cliff had come home from the rail yard after his first week of work and sat down at the kitchen table and looked like he had been hit by something he had not seen coming, and how Walter had sat down across from him and not said anything for 20 minutes because he had known the boy needed to process the weight of what he had taken on before he could talk about it. He wrote about Nadine. He wrote about her in the careful, specific way of a man who had loved his daughter-in-law not as a formal relation, but as a person he had chosen to love, because she had earned it, because she had loved his son with her whole attention, and his son had been lit up by it in a way Walter had hoped for without believing in. He read until his eyes would not focus anymore, and then he put the letters carefully back in the bundle and retied the red string and set them on the seat beside the satchel. He reached into the satchel. The envelope was thick and sealed with a strip of packing tape that had gone brittle. Inside were property documents. A deed dated 1989 describing 14 acres adjoining the original 6 purchased from a rancher named Aldrich, who had been selling off parcels of an old homestead along Powerline Road. The deed was in Cliff's name, not Walter's name. Cliff's name placed there in 1989 when Cliff was in his late 30s and had no idea his father was buying land in his name in eastern Oregon. The property tax notices for this additional parcel would have been arriving at whatever address Walter had listed on the purchase and then forwarding to Cliff after Walter died. And Cliff had been paying them for 19 years without understanding what they were. For the amount so modest, they had vanished into the routine of the annual tax cycle without demanding examination. He owned 20 acres. He had owned 20 acres for 35 years and had not known it. There was a second document, a trust instrument prepared by an attorney named Calhoun and Associates, Boise, Idaho, dated 2004, 1 year before Walter died. The language of it was formal and careful, and it said in the clear terms that lawyers use when they want something to be unambiguous, that the 6 acres and the 14 acres and the railroad car and all improvements thereto were held in an irrevocable trust for the sole benefit of Clifford Raymond Hargrove, that no other party had any claim on these assets, and that the trustee of record, Walter Raymond Hargrove, had arranged for the trust to become self-executing upon his death, at which point Cliff became the outright owner of everything described within. There was a cover letter from Calhoun's office dated November 2005, 2 weeks after Walter's death, notifying Cliff of his inheritance of the trust property. The address on the letter was the Caldwell Street house. He had sold the Caldwell Street house in 2016 and handed the proceeds to Merritt. He had never seen this letter. It had arrived at an address he no longer had and gone somewhere into the uncollected mail of a sold house and had never found him. But the trust itself had been real and was real, and the property had been his the entire time. He sat in the dark Pullman car with the documents on his lap and understood what Walter had done. Walter had understood in 2004 that something might happen. He had not known what. He had not known about Derek Ashford because Derek Ashford had not yet arrived in Claudette's life. But Walter had understood something about the architecture of vulnerability and had done what engineers do, which is design for failure. He had taken the assets that could not be protected by attitude or hope or the goodwill of others and had protected them by law in the most irrevocable form available, so that regardless of what happened in the years that followed, regardless of who came and what they wanted and what they were willing to do to get at these 20 acres and this Pullman car and everything on this land, would remain exactly where Walter had put them. For his boy, for Clifford, he reached back into the satchel. The railroad bonds were in a separate portfolio inside a document sleeve that had protected them from the humidity and the decades. He counted them in the flashlight beam. 31 bonds in varying denominations, from old Northern Pacific issues to Union Pacific papers to several certificates. He did not immediately recognize the printing elaborate in the way of official documents from the early and middle 20th century. With each bond in the portfolio was a small index card in Walter's handwriting, a date, a source, a price paid. The earliest was from 1975. The most recent was from 2004. The notebook was at the bottom of the satchel. He opened it to the last entry, dated September 2005, 6 weeks before Walter died. Had the collection appraised by Hennessy on the 14th. His estimate, current market, $264,000. The older Northern Pacific bonds have appreciated more than I expected. I have not sold any of them. I will hold. I believe they will continue to appreciate. If Clifford is reading this in any year after 2010, the figure will be higher. I want him to know I did not gamble with this. I researched every purchase. I understood what I was buying. This is not luck. This is 40 years of patience and attention. Clifford will understand that. He closed the notebook. He put it back in the satchel with the bonds and the documents and the letters. He closed the satchel and fastened the buckle and held the key in his hand for a moment before putting it back on the cord around his neck. He sat in the dark for a long time. He thought about what $264,000 meant in 2005 and what it might mean now, 20 years later, with 2 decades of appreciation on bonds that Walter had already identified as climbing. He thought about 20 acres of eastern Oregon high desert and the value of land in this part of the country, and the Pullman car itself, which Leonard had said was a piece of railroad history that certain people would pay significant money to see properly restored. He thought about the trust document and the name Calhoun and the office address on the letterhead, which was in Boise. He was not poor. He had not been poor since the moment Claudette had told him to leave and he had put the key around his neck and walked out the door. He had only believed he was poor, which was a different thing, and the difference between believing something and it being true was exactly the size of a leather satchel hidden in the ceiling of a 1947 Pullman car on 20 acres of land in eastern Oregon. He got the camp stove going and heated water and made oatmeal and ate it in the dark and drank coffee and did not hurry any of it. When he was done, he washed the cup and the bowl with a small amount of water and dried them and put them on the luggage rack beside the percolator with the care of a man establishing routines in a new place, the small, orderly habits that tell the body it is home. The night was very quiet. The coyotes had set up somewhere to the east a chorus of them, working through whatever coyotes work through at 10 in the evening in the eastern Oregon high desert, and the sound of them was not threatening but companionable, in the way that the sounds of living things at night are companionable when you have been alone in silence for too long. He lay on the bench with his coat over him, in the satchel on the seat across from him, where he could see its outline in the dark, and he thought about Walter. He thought about Walter at 69 walking this land with Leonard Briggs on a Saturday in 2002, knowing something, having already taken the steps that needed taking. He thought about Walter as a young man, 20 years old, stepping into the Union Pacific as a brakeman, choosing a life of physical precision and long distances, and the satisfaction that comes from moving things reliably from where they are to where they need to be. He thought about Walter at the kitchen table on Caldwell Street on a Sunday morning, with the newspaper and his coffee, a man who took up exactly the space he needed, and not a foot more, a man who had never explained himself unnecessarily and had never needed to because his actions explained him. He thought about the letter. I made sure of it. In the morning, he would walk to Callaway Creek. He would call Leonard Briggs from the payphone outside Fitch Provisions. He would tell Leonard plainly and without drama what he had found. Leonard would know what to do next because Leonard was a man like Walter, a man shaped by the same industry, in the same decades, in the same understanding of how to handle things that need handling without making a production of it. He pulled his coat around him and lay down on the bench and closed his eyes, and this time, for the first time since the morning Nadine had gone into the hospital and not come home, he slept straight through until dawn. The morning he called Leonard was a Thursday, 4 days after arriving at Callaway Creek, when the frost on the clearing was particularly sharp and the sky above the ridge had gone the pale, pure blue of high desert mornings in late October. He walked the 3 miles to town in the cold, with his hands in his jacket pockets, and the satchel under his arm, and the key against his chest, and he used the payphone outside Fitch Provisions, and told Leonard, in the plainest terms available to him, what he had found inside the Pullman car. Leonard was quiet on the other end of the line for a long time. Then he said, "Cliff, don't tell another soul. Stay at the property. I'll be there in 2 hours with a man from Boise who has known your father's work for a very long time." The man from Boise was Gideon Marsh. He had been a coin and railroad bond dealer for 40 years, operating out of a shop on 8th Street that Walter had visited regularly from the mid-70s onward. He drove up Powerline Road in a clean black sedan and got out and looked at the property in the car with the methodical attention of someone whose profession required accurate assessment of things at a distance. He shook Cliff's hand and looked at him the way people look at a man's son when they knew the father well, finding the resemblance and noting it without comment. He went inside the Pullman and spent 2.5 hours with the bonds, working through them one at a time with a loop and a worn leather ledger he had carried in a briefcase that itself looked like a piece of the same era as the bonds. He cataloged, he made notes, he asked Cliff questions about provenance when the index cards did not fully cover it, and when Cliff did not know, he simply noted that too and moved on. When he came out, he sat on the vestibule steps and took his glasses off and rubbed the bridge of his nose with the careful motion of a man whose eyes have been doing close work for a very long time. "Your father had a very good eye," he said, "and a great deal of discipline. He did not buy impulsively. Every purchase in that notebook is defensible at the price he paid. Several of them are quite remarkable given what he paid and what they're worth now." He looked at Cliff steadily. "My current estimate," he said, "is $312,000 for the bond collection. Some of the older Northern Pacific issues have done better than even your father's last appraisal suggested. I can offer you 90,000 cash for a selected portion of the collection today. For the rest, I would need time to broker the sales properly, get them in front of the right buyers. Cliff sat on the vestibule step beside him and looked out at the clearing at the junipers along the fence line, at a red-tailed hawk that had come to rest on the fence post near the gate, regarding the property with the settled authority of a creature that has decided something. My father left a trust document, Cliff said. Calhoun and Associates in Boise. The land is in my name outright. I want to make sure that's solid before I do anything else. Gideon nodded. I know Calhoun's office. I'll verify the filing status. He paused. Cliff, I want to be direct with you. What your father built here, the collection, the land, the trust structure, this was not an accident or a hobby. This was deliberate long-range specific provision. He thought about you. He thought about what you might need and when you might need it. That kind of care is not common. Cliff was quiet for a moment. No, he said, it isn't. He rode back to Boise with Gideon that afternoon. He opened a new bank account at a branch he had not used before, not the bank where he and Nadine had banked for 30 years, not any bank where Merritt or Claudette had accounts. He deposited Gideon's cashier's check. He rented a safety deposit box at a different institution and put the satchel in it, the letters, the documents, the bonds, that were not going to Gideon, all of it, secured in 2 layers of institutions with no connection to each other and no connection to anyone named Hargrove except himself. He bought a prepaid cell phone at a drugstore near the bank. He bought a pair of boots, actual work boots, the kind with the steel toe and the ankle support, because if he was going to do what he was planning to do, he was going to need his feet to be right. He bought a heavy canvas work jacket and 3 flannel shirts and 2 pairs of work pants and a wool cap and a good pair of gloves that would last through a high desert winter. He took the bus back to Callaway Creek that evening with $60,000 in a new bank account and a phone and clothes that fit the work he was about to do. He walked back up Powerline Road in the dark, the flashlight making a cone of pale light on the rutted dirt, the stars overhead extraordinary, in the way that stars are extraordinary when there is no competing light for 30 miles in any direction. He could navigate by them roughly the way Walter had taught him on a camping trip when Cliff was 12, which was the same trip Walter had taught him to read a compass and start a fire with 1 match and identify the plants along a creek bank that would tell you about the quality of the water. He came through the gate and crossed the clearing and went up the vestibule steps and into the Pullman. Through the proper door, the front door, the door that was now open and working as it had been designed to work. He sat in the dark with $60,000 in a bank account he had opened 4 hours ago, and 20 acres of land that had been his for 35 years, and a letter from his dead father that said, I made sure of it, and he thought about what came next. What came next was work. Real work, sustained work, the kind of work that takes months and requires a man to be present every day and to make decisions and solve problems and use his hands and his judgment together the way he had used them for 50 years in the rail yards. The kind of work that Walter had always said was the only thing that actually changed the shape of a life. He was Clifford Raymond Hargrove, Walter's boy, and he had work to do. He pulled his coat around him and lay down and closed his eyes and slept. The days that followed established themselves into a rhythm that the land seemed to have called out of him rather than one he had designed. Up at 5, the percolator on the camp stove, the walk of the perimeter in the early light. Then work, whatever work the day required, clearing brush from the inside of the fence line, outward cutting cheat grass and bitter brush, with a brush hook he bought at Fitch Provisions, and stacking it in piles to burn. The property was revealing itself to him the way properties do when you attend to them, showing him what it had been before the years of neglect and what it could be again. Leonard came out twice a week, and they worked together in the companionable near silence of men who do not need to fill time with words. He was 62 days from a knee replacement and was supposed to be limiting his physical activity, which he interpreted as not lifting things above his head and otherwise doing whatever he considered reasonable, which was considerable. Dorothy came the second time he came and brought a pot of bean soup that lasted Cliff 3 days, and Dorothy said that Leonard had told her about Walter's boy, and she had needed to see for herself, and she was glad she had. "What did he tell you?" Cliff asked. "That Walter used to say his boy was the most stubborn man he had ever raised, and the most careful, and that those two qualities would either save him or kill him, depending on the situation," Dorothy said. She smiled. Leonard always said Walter said it like it was the finest compliment he knew how to give. Cliff read one of Walter's letters each evening by the light of the LED lantern he had bought at Fitch Provisions. He had established this as a rule for himself, one letter per evening, not because the content was too much to take in larger quantities, but because the letters deserved that kind of attention. Each one was a complete thing, its own weight in its own shape, and reading them at that pace allowed him to stay with each one long enough for it to settle properly. Walter wrote about the rail yards in ways that made them live. He wrote about specific runs, specific weather, specific nights, when the conditions on the line required decisions that had to be made in seconds and that he had lived with afterward for years. He wrote about the nature of responsibility, the specific kind that comes from being the man at the controls of something that can kill people if you are not fully present to it at all times, and about what that kind of responsibility does to a man over 40 years. How it shapes the way you see everything, how it makes you precise, and how it makes you patient, and how it makes you sometimes very tired in a way that ordinary rest does not fix. He wrote about Cliff's mother, who had died when Cliff was 11, in a way he had never spoken of her while he was alive. He wrote about what it had been like to raise a boy alone in the years after the particular weight of being solely responsible for a child's understanding of how to be a person in the world. He wrote that he had made mistakes and that most of his mistakes had come from not saying enough, rather than from saying the wrong things, that he was a man who believed actions spoke more clearly than words, and that he had used this belief sometimes as permission to avoid the harder business of putting things into language. "I am trying to correct that now," Walter wrote in a letter dated May of 2005. "I have run out of time for the belief that it will be obvious. Some things need to be said plainly. You were a good son, Clifford. You are a good man. I know I did not say this often enough, and I am saying it now while I still can, and I want you to keep it. Not as sentiment, as information. You are a good man, and the things you build with, that will outlast both of us." Cliff sat with that letter until the lantern's battery dropped low enough to turn the light amber, and then he folded it carefully and retied the red string around the bundle and put the bundle back in the satchel and sat in the dark for a while longer. That evening, he read the 17th letter. It was longer than the other 6 pages in Walter's careful block hand, and it did not begin the way the others began. There was no date at the top, just his name, Clifford. He had written it, Walter explained, after Merritt and Claudette's first anniversary. He had done something he was not entirely comfortable with. He wrote, but had done anyway because he needed to know. He had hired a man in Boise, a private investigator whose name he did not include in the letter, to look into Claudette's history before she married Merritt. He had not told anyone. He had not told Sullivan. He had not told Cliff. What the investigator found was not criminal. It was not illegal. But it was a pattern the way certain things are, patterns legible only when you see enough of them lined up in sequence. A previous marriage brief to a man 15 years older who had owned property in Coeur d'Alene. A dispute over that property after the divorce that had gone to mediation. A settlement that had favored Claudette in ways the ex-husband's attorney had called irregular in a letter that had made it into the public record. A second relationship, undocumented, with a man in Spokane who had later filed a civil complaint that was subsequently withdrawn under circumstances the investigator could not fully clarify. None of it proves anything, Walter wrote, and the handwriting on this page was slightly different than the others, more deliberate, as if he had chosen each word with particular care. A man who has been a railroad engineer for 40 years understands that a signal can be ambiguous, but an engineer also learns that ambiguous signals are the ones you slow down for. You do not accelerate through a signal you cannot read. You reduce speed, you observe, you wait for clarity. "I did not tell you this," Walter continued, "because I could not take from Merritt what he had chosen. A man's marriage is his own. If I had told you, you would have told Merritt, and Merritt would have had to live knowing his father had hired someone to investigate his wife, and whatever that did to his marriage and to your relationship with him, that would have been my doing. I decided I could not do that. But I could protect what was yours, and I did. Everything on that land, the acres, the car, the collection, all of it is held in a trust that no court in Idaho can penetrate, and no divorce proceeding can touch, and no claim of shared family inheritance can reach. I thought of everything I could think of. I am sorry I could not think of more. Cliff set the letter down on the bench beside him. He sat in the dark Pullman car and looked at the window across from him and thought about his father in 2003, sitting across from a man in a Boise office, listening to a report about his daughter-in-law, and then going home and saying nothing to anyone, and instead making a phone call to Calhoun's office to arrange the irrevocable trust that would 19 years later make it impossible for anyone to take this land from his son. That was Walter. That was exactly Walter. The signal is ambiguous. Slow down. Protect what you can protect. Do not accelerate through what you cannot fully read. He picked the letter back up and read it again to the end. Then he folded it with the others and tied the red string and sat for a long time in the dark with the sound of the high desert night around him. The coyotes and the wind and the settling of the old car and the vast quiet of a sky full of stars over 20 acres of land that no one could take from him. Callum Breck drove up Powerline Road on a Wednesday morning in early November, 2 weeks after Cliff had deposited Gideon Marsh's check and bought his work boots and ridden the bus back to Callaway Creek. He came in a white work truck with a magnetized sign on the door that said, Breck Restoration and Renovation Bend. And he drove with the unhurried confidence of a man who has spent 30 years arriving at difficult properties and has learned that the property rarely improves with rushing toward it. He was in his mid-50s, weathered in the way of men who work outside year-round in high desert country, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same volcanic rock that surfaced along Powerline Road. He got out of the truck and stood at the gate and looked at the Pullman car for a long time without saying anything. Cliff stood beside him and let him look. This was something he had learned from Walter from decades of watching Walter assess situations, that the first thing a competent man does when he encounters a problem is give it his full and uninterrupted attention. Interrupting that process with words was almost always a mistake. Breck walked the car the way Leonard had walked it and the way Cliff himself had walked it on that first morning, one hand trailing along the side, reading the metal under his fingers. He crouched at the wheel trucks and looked at what the vines had done and what the rust had done and what 40 years of sitting on an abandoned section of track in eastern Oregon had done to the undercarriage. He went inside through the vestibule and stood in the middle of the car for 10 minutes with a flashlight and a small wooden probe he used to test the integrity of materials tapping, listening, pressing his thumb against surfaces, engaging the resistance. He went into the porter's compartment and spent time there. He came back out through the vestibule and stood on the step and looked at the roof. Sound, he said. The bones are sound. That's the only thing that matters with a car this old. Everything else is cosmetic. Even the rust on the roof is surface rust, not structural penetration, which on a 40-year neglected steel roof is frankly surprising. Your father must have done something to that roof before he left it here. He sealed it, Cliff said. There was a notation in the maintenance records. Summer of 1985, he had the roof sealed with a coal tar compound. Industrial grade. Breck nodded at that the way a craftsman nods when a decision made decades ago by someone he has never met turns out to have been exactly right. Smart man, he said. He was. Breck wrote figures in a small notebook while they stood in the clearing with their coffee cliffs from the percolator and Breck's from the thermos he had brought, and the morning light coming low in gold across the junipers. He quoted the job in sections: roof remediation, floor replacement, window, restoration, kitchen, installation, bathroom fitting, electrical and solar water system, heating, interior finishing. He built in a contingency for the things that would go wrong in ways that could not be predicted, because in his experience there were always things that went wrong in ways that could not be predicted, and the only honest thing to do was price for them rather than pretend they would not happen. 38,000, he said. 4-month timeline if we start before Thanksgiving. I have a crew that finishes a project in Bend mid-November, and I can move them out here after that. You'd be looking at occupancy in March. Cliff looked at the car. He looked at the property. He thought about the money in the account and what Gideon Marsh was going to bring him from the remaining bonds and the 20 acres under his feet. He held out his hand and Breck shook it. Cliff was clear about his priorities. He wanted the original materials preserved wherever preservation was possible. He wanted the brass fittings polished, not replaced. He wanted the velvet bench seats reupholstered in the closest match to the original color that could be sourced, which Breck said he knew a woman in Portland who specialized in exactly this kind of period textile restoration. He wanted the porter's compartment at the far end converted to a proper bedroom, a real bed adequate for a man of 74 who was done sleeping on benches. He wanted the roof to outlast him, which Breck said was the only correct ambition for a roof. He wanted the car to look like what it was, a 1947 Pullman heavyweight that had been built to last and had lasted and had earned whatever it was now going to become. While the crew was finishing their Bend project, Cliff stayed on the property. He did not go to a motel. The decision was simple. This was his property, and he was going to be on it. He spent the days doing what could be done before the crew arrived, clearing brush, assessing the fence lines, identifying where the driveway would need to be graded and where the well would need to be drilled. He drilled the well in the third week of November, the driller finding water at 62 feet in the location Cliff had identified by reading the drainage patterns on the north side of the property, the way Walter had taught him to read land, by understanding what water does when it moves through ground and where it settles when it stops. One afternoon in late November, when the crew had left for the day and the temperature was dropping hard, Cliff sat on the vestibule steps and called Sullivan Greaves in Boise on the prepaid cell phone. Sullivan had been Walter's closest friend from the Union Pacific years. He had listened both times Cliff had called since arriving at Callaway Creek, with the careful attention he brought to everything, and had asked precise questions, and had not offered opinions that had not been asked for, which was the quality in him that Walter had most valued. He told Sullivan about the bonds and the land and the trust document and what Gideon Marsh had said. Sullivan was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I want to tell you something, Cliff. Walter told me once, probably 2003, maybe early 2004, that he had done something for you that he hoped you would never need, but that he was certain you would know what to do with when the time came. He did not tell me what it was. I asked, and he said it was between him and you, and that was sufficient. I have thought about that conversation a number of times in the years since." Cliff said he always thought further ahead than anyone around him knew. Sullivan said that is the most accurate thing anyone has ever said about your father. Then he said, "How is the car coming along?" "Good bones," Cliff said. "Good bones and good work." The renovation proceeded through December and into the new year. The crew arrived the third week of November, 4 men from Bend, who worked with the efficient economy of people who have done difficult work together for a long time and know how to begin without preamble. They called him Mr. Hargrove without being told to. Breck had briefed them on the nature of the project and on the nature of the client, and they came prepared to treat both with care. Cliff moved into a wall tent at the south edge of the clearing, close enough to hear the work, and far enough from it to stay out of the way. His daily routine organized itself around the renovation up at 5 Coffee, from the percolator on the camp stove, the perimeter walk, then groundwork while the crew worked the car. The driveway graded, the fence on the north and east sides replaced, the track section stabilized and properly set, the clearing leveled for a proper approach from the gate to the vestibule steps. The solar array went on the roof the second week, 8 panels on a south-facing rack wired to a battery bank under the car, enough power for lights and a small refrigerator in the internet router. The water line ran from the wellhead to the car in freezing ground during the third week. The floor came out in sections, the original hardwood too far gone in most places to save, and went back in as new white oak over the steel subfloor, sealed and finished to a warmth that picked up the afternoon light through the restored windows and held it. The windows were the original frames cleaned and reglazed, the glass replaced with double pane units that matched the profile of the originals, closely enough that you had to look carefully to see the difference. The velvet came back in February. The woman from Portland drove out with the reupholstered seat backs and cushions wrapped in muslin, and Cliff sat on the vestibule steps and watched them installed. The color was the original color, a deep forest green matched from a small sample preserved under the seat framing, where it had been protected from light and air for 7 decades. Against the white oak floor, in the polished brass of the window fittings, the seats looked like what they were, the interior of a car built with pride in an era when the railroads believed they were building the future. He stood in the doorway when it was done and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Breck stood beside him. He said nothing, which was correct. The kitchen went in at the near end, compact and complete, a propane range and a real sink in a small refrigerator and shelving built to match the original luggage rack aesthetic. The porter's compartment held a queen bed frame with a reading lamp on each side and a small built-in wardrobe. The bathroom fitted into the vestibule equipment space, a composting toilet, and a shower with a fold-down teak bench and enough hot water from the propane tank under the car to take a real shower. There was a mirror above the small vanity. The first time Cliff looked in it after everything was finished, he did not immediately recognize the man looking back. He had spent 8 years making himself invisible in Merritt and Claudette's house, shrinking himself to the dimensions of the space he was permitted to occupy. And what the mirror was showing him was what happened to a man's face when that stopped. He looked like Walter. He had known this in the abstract for years, the family resemblance that other people noted and that you can never quite see in yourself. But standing in the bathroom of the finished Pullman car on a March morning with the light coming through the new windows and his work clothes and his work boots and the brass key still on its cord around his neck, he saw it plainly. The set of the jaw, the way the eyes took in the whole room rather than looking at any particular thing in it. The trained, comprehensive awareness of a man who has spent his life in environments where knowing the full situation at once was not optional. Walter's boy, yes. He moved in on the 15th of March, which was also the anniversary of the day he and Nadine had bought the house on Caldwell Street, a fact he had not planned and noticed only when he was lying in the real bed in the porter's compartment that first night, looking at the ceiling of the Pullman in the dark and doing the arithmetic of his own life. He lay there in the quiet for a long time. No bench seat, no coat over him, no cold getting in through the gaps. Just the bed and the dark and the particular small sounds of a Pullman car that has people in it again settling into the presence of warmth and use. He thought about Nadine. He thought about what she would have said about the bed, which was that it was about time, and about the kitchen, which was that the propane range was better than the electric one they'd had on Caldwell Street, and about the view from the west-facing windows across the cleared property to the Juniper Ridge, which was that she wished she had seen it sooner. He thought about her the way he thought about her every night, with the specific gratitude of a man who had been loved well and knew it, which is rarer than people acknowledge. He was home. The word arrived in him not as a thought but as a physical fact. The way temperature arrives, the way the smell of coffee arrives at 5 in the morning before you are fully awake. He was home. This land, this car, this air, these stars through the window of the porter's compartment. This was the place he was from in the only way that mattered, which was the way a man is from the decisions of the people who loved him before he knew he needed to be loved. Spring came to the property the way spring comes to high desert country. Not gently but decisively, the sage going silver green overnight, and the first bitterbrush flowers appearing on the south-facing slope by the first week of April. A pair of red-tailed hawks had taken up residence along the eastern ridge, riding the morning thermals with the settled authority of creatures that have claimed territory and intend to keep it. Cliff planted the kitchen garden in April. 4 raised beds on the south side of the car built from lumber left over from the floor replacement. He planted what Walter had planted in the garden on Caldwell Street, potatoes and tomatoes and beans, and 1 bed of herbs, sage and thyme and flat-leaf parsley. He planted them in the order Walter had planted them, which he remembered because Walter had explained the logic of it on a Saturday morning when Cliff was 12, explaining that you plant in the order of what can tolerate cold, because the season in high desert country is short and you cannot waste the early weeks. Waverly Pruitt had come in April. She was a journalist and essayist who wrote about rural living and unconventional domestic architecture for a collection of regional publications and a newsletter that had developed a substantial following. Leonard had mentioned Cliff to her through Dorothy, through the small-town chain of connection that Cliff had not tracked closely, but that had delivered Waverly to his gate on a Tuesday afternoon with a camera bag and a notebook and the particular alert stillness of a writer who is working. She asked if she could write about the Pullman. He said yes after thinking about it for 2 days, not because he needed the attention, but because Walter's story deserved to be told, and he was not sure he would ever tell it any other way. She came back 3 times over 2 weeks. She was methodical and respectful, and she asked questions that went past the surface and listened to the answers with the full attention that good questions deserve. She photographed the car from every angle, in the garden, in the property, in the ridge, and once with his permission, Cliff himself standing at the vestibule steps with his hands in his jacket pockets and his face turned toward the camera with what she later described in the piece as the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not expect and found it was where he was supposed to be. The piece ran in May, nearly 3,000 words covering the Pullman's history and the property's history and Walter's history and what Cliff had done in the months since arriving with 2 bags and a percolator and a key on a cord. It ran first in the regional magazine and then on her newsletter, and then it traveled the way things travel when they are true and specific and about something people recognize, even if they have never experienced it directly. Regional newspapers picked it up. A design publication in Portland ran a photo spread. A public radio affiliate in Bend reached out about a feature segment. Cliff did not pursue any of it. He answered the letters that came, the ones forwarded through Waverly and the ones that found him through Norma Fitch, who had become a reliable clearinghouse for correspondence directed at what people had started calling simply the Pullman property. He answered them because they deserved answers and because a number of them were from people who had read the story and recognized something in it that they needed to name aloud to someone. He was reading one of these letters on the vestibule steps on a Wednesday morning in June when he heard a car on Powerline Road. It was not Leonard's truck. It was not Breck's. It was a sedan, older one of the Japanese models from the early 2000s that had lost their finish to the years and the sun, and it pulled up to the gate and stopped and sat there with the engine running before the engine went off. The woman who got out was Claudette Voss Hargrove. He had expected this in the abstract way that you expect things you know are coming without knowing when. He had expected it since Waverly's piece had gone wider than either of them had anticipated. He had expected it since Gideon Marsh had called in April to tell him that the remaining bonds had sold and the total realized from the collection after Gideon's commission was $287,000, and that the conversation around railroad collectibles in certain circles had made the sale visible to people who followed that market. He put the letter down on the step beside him. Claudette was not dressed for a client meeting. She was dressed for a long drive, jeans and a cotton blouse, her hair down rather than pulled back, and she looked like she had lost weight in the months since he had last seen her, which was the morning she had held the front door open and said, "Good luck, Cliff. I hope you find your peace." She stood at the gate and looked at the property, and then at the car, and then at him, and whatever she had prepared to say did not appear to be arriving in the order she had arranged it. He did not go to the gate. He sat on the vestibule steps and waited. She came through the gate and crossed the cleared gravel approach and stopped at the base of the steps. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. The morning was clear and warm, and the garden on the south side was coming in with the particular abundance of plants that had been put in good soil and watered consistently. "Cliff," she said. "Claudette." She looked at the car. She looked at the garden. She looked at the cleared property and the new fence and the gravel drive and the solar panels on the roof and the wrought iron gate Leonard had sourced from a metalworker in Burns. "I saw the article," she said. "I read it." She paused, and in the pause he could see her arranging and rearranging what she had come to say. "I just needed to see it. I needed to see that you were all right." He let that sit in the air between them for a moment. I've been all right for a while now, he said. I know. I can see that. She looked at her hands. The rose gold watch she had worn when he lived in the house on Fortuna Avenue was not on her wrist. I heard about Derek, she said. I assume you heard as well. I heard. She nodded. Then she looked up at him, and he saw in her face something he had not fully expected, which was not the calculation he had always associated with her. Not the flat efficiency of a woman closing a transaction, but something closer to the actual experience of a person who has gone through a significant amount and arrived somewhere they had not planned to be. Merritt doesn't know I'm here, she said. We're separated. Since February. He said nothing. She stopped. She looked at the ground and then back at him. Whatever she had rehearsed on the 6-hour drive out here had rearranged itself into something she had not planned to say. What I did, she said finally. Not what we did. What I did. Merritt had his part. But I drove it. I want you to know that. Claudette, he said, I want to ask you something and I want you to answer me honestly. She looked at him. Did Merritt know at the time about the refinance and Derek Ashford? Did he go into it, understanding what Ashford was? She was quiet for long enough that the answer was in the silence before she spoke it. He knew about the refinance, she said. He believed in the investment. As far as Derek goes, he thought Derek was legitimate. So did I, she added with the flatness of someone who has stopped being able to offer that as mitigation and knows it. Cliff nodded once. He looked out at the ridge where the hawks had gone earlier in the morning, somewhere beyond the tree line, now invisible but present. You can tell him, he said, that the door here is not closed. That is not the same as it being open, but it is not closed. If he wants to come out here and sit on these steps and talk, I will not turn him away. Can you tell him that? She looked at him for a moment. Yes, she said. I'll tell him. She left without asking to see the inside of the car. He did not offer. She drove back down Powerline Road and he watched the dust settle behind her tires and then went inside and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the ridge. He thought about Merritt at 7 with the fish holding it up with both hands grinning into the camera, the fish nearly as long as his arm. He thought about the voice at 2 in the morning saying once the old man's out. He thought about the distance between those two things and whether a man could cross it and what the crossing required and what it looked like from the other side. He thought about Walter's letter. Whatever happens next, build something that lasts. Not for me, for the boy. 3 weeks later, he was reading in the evening one of the letters he had now read twice and was reading for the third time because the third reading always gave him something the first two had not when his phone rang. The prepaid cell on the counter beside the percolator. The number was a Boise area code he did not recognize. He answered. Dad. The voice was Merritt's. He sat down on the bench seat and put his hand flat on the forest green velvet and looked at the window across from him where the evening light was doing what it did this time of year in eastern Oregon, going gold and long across the ridge, and then dropping fast and leaving everything very clear and very quiet. Merritt, he said, I heard what you said to Claudette. He paused. I don't know if I have the right to call. I know I don't have the right. He stopped. There was the sound of a man trying to locate something in himself and not being certain it was there. You can call, Cliff said. You can always call. I'm sorry, Merritt said. For what it's worth now, I know it doesn't undo anything. I know what I said that night. I know you heard it. I've known that since the morning you were gone, and I kept thinking about it, and I couldn't stop thinking about it, and I didn't know what to do with it, and so I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry for all of it. Cliff looked at the photograph on the shelf above the kitchen. The one of Nadine in the yellow dress at the state fair, her face lit up at something off camera, her whole self laughing. Beside it was the one of Walter on the last day of the mainline run, his hand on the wheel housing the grin of a man who has done the thing he was put on earth to do. He thought about Walter's last letter. He had read it 4 times by now and had not told anyone what it said. Not Leonard, not Sullivan, not Gideon, because it was between him and Walter, and that was sufficient. But he knew what was in it, and he knew what it asked of him. And the ask was not complicated. It was just hard in the way that the right things are usually hard. "Come out here," Cliff said. "Come on a weekend when you can stay a night. We'll sit on the steps. We'll have coffee. We'll talk or we won't talk, whichever way it goes." There was a long pause on the line. "Yeah," Merritt said. His voice had changed in some way Cliff could not precisely name. It had the sound of a man who has been holding something at arm's length for a long time and has just been given permission to set it down. "Yeah, I'd like that." He came on a Saturday in late July. He drove up in a car Cliff had not seen before, a sensible sedan. Dark blue, the kind of car a man buys when he is not trying to signal anything. He came alone. He got out at the gate and stood there and looked at the property and the car the way everyone stood at that gate and looked the pause of a person encountering something that does not match what they had imagined. He was 45 years old and he was thin in the way people get thin when they have had a difficult year. And he had his grandfather's jaw, which Cliff had not let himself fully notice before the Hargrove jaw, that looked like it had been shaped by the same geological forces that had made this country. Cliff was at the vestibule steps. He stood up when Merritt came through the gate. They looked at each other across 30 feet of cleared gravel in the afternoon heat. Then Merritt walked across the gravel and stopped at the base of the steps. And Cliff stepped down from the steps, and they stood on the same level for the first time in a very long time. And Merritt put his hand out, and Cliff took it, and they shook hands. And then Cliff pulled him in and put his arms around him, and Merritt stood still for a moment like a man who has forgotten what this feels like, and then held on. They did not say anything for a while. Then they sat on the vestibule steps in the afternoon sun. Father and son and Cliff poured coffee from the percolator into 2 cups and handed one to Merritt, and they sat together and looked at the property and the juniper ridge and the hawks working the upper thermals and the garden coming in full and abundant on the south side of the car. Merritt asked about the garden. Cliff told him about the planting order, the logic of what goes in cold ground first. The way Walter had explained it on a Saturday morning in 1969, to a boy who would have preferred to be anywhere else and who had stored the information anyway, in the way that children store things, adults teach them when they are paying attention without meaning to. Merritt said, "I didn't know Granddad had this place." "Not many people did," Cliff said. "That was the point, I think. He built it for a purpose, and the purpose required him to keep it quiet." What was the purpose? Cliff looked at his son the way Walter had looked at things that required the full and uninterrupted attention of a man who understood what he was seeing. "To make sure I was all right no matter what happened," he said. "That's what fathers do when they do it right." Merritt looked at the ground. He was quiet for a moment. "I know I wasn't," he said. "All right, to you. No, I don't have an explanation that's worth much." "I'm not looking for an explanation," Cliff said. "I'm looking at my son sitting on my father's Pullman car on my father's land on a Saturday in July. That's what I'm looking at. That's enough for right now." They sat until the sun went behind the ridge and the temperature dropped fast the way it does in high desert country, sudden and clean, and the stars began to appear with the extravagant density of skies that have no competing light for miles. Cliff made dinner on the propane range, eggs and toast and beans, the simple dinner of men who cook for themselves, and they ate at the small table by the window and did not talk much, but the silence was not uncomfortable. After dinner, Cliff showed Merritt the car. He walked him through it the way you walk someone through a place you have made, pointing out the things worth pointing out: the restored original velvet, the brass fittings, the white oak floor, the way the afternoon light came through the west windows at a particular angle in summer and lit the whole interior gold. He showed him the porter's compartment and the bed and the small wardrobe. He showed him the kitchen and the reading lamp and the shelf above the kitchen where the photographs lived. Merritt stopped at the photographs. He looked at the one of Nadine in the yellow dress for a long time. Then he looked at the one of Walter on the last day of the mainline run. "He was a good man," Merritt said. "Granddad." "The best I knew," Cliff said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think you are too. I think I forgot that somewhere. I think I let myself forget it because it was easier than the alternative." Cliff looked at his son. He thought about Walter's last letter, the 20th, dated 2 days before Walter died, written in a hand that had already been changed by what was happening, but was still precise. Still Walter's, still the hand of a man who did things correctly, even at the end. He had read that letter 5 times by now, and the last paragraph, which he had been building toward through each previous reading, had arrived finally with the full weight it had always been carrying. Clifford Walter had written, "I have watched you your whole life. I have watched you be a good son and a good husband and a good father, and I know that the last one has been the hardest, and that the hardest parts have not been your fault, though I know you have blamed yourself for them anyway, because that is the kind of man you are. Do not carry blame for things that were not yours to carry. What is yours to carry is what I have left you: the land, the work of it, the knowledge that I believed in you from the beginning, and I believe in you now, and whatever comes after this letter, I will believe in you still. Take care of yourself, son. Take care of the boy when you can. That is all I ask. All my love, Dad." He sat with that letter now in the sense that it was inside him the way things become inside you when you have read them carefully enough, times when they have moved from the page into the place where you keep the things that are true. He looked at Merritt. "You didn't forget it," he said. "You just got turned around for a while. That happens to men. The point is finding your way back." Merritt looked at him. He nodded the slow, deliberate nod of a man who is accepting something he has needed to accept for a long time. Cliff poured 2 more cups of coffee, and they went back out to the vestibule steps and sat in the night with the stars overhead and the coyotes starting up somewhere to the east and the smell of sage in the cool air. Somewhere on the ridge above the hawks had gone to wherever hawks go when the light finally leaves quiet, now settled in the dark. Cliff thought about the last year. He thought about the Tuesday morning and the 4 days and the Greyhound ticket and the dirt road and the rusted car in the clearing and the ceiling panel and the satchel coming down from the frame above and the key turning in the lock and the letter in Walter's handwriting telling him that everything was going to be all right, that everything had been prepared, that he had been thought of and provided for by a man who had understood decades before it was necessary to understand it exactly what his boy was going to need. He thought about all of this, and then he let it go. The way you let go of a weight when you have carried it far enough that you have arrived where the carrying was meant to take you. He was 74 years old, and he was sitting on his father's Pullman car on a July night in eastern Oregon with his son beside him, and the stars above, and the garden full of things growing in the dark, the way things grow when you have given them what they need quietly, without requiring an audience doing the work they were built to do. He raised his coffee cup toward the ridge, toward the dark, toward wherever Walter was. The coffee was strong. He had made it the way Walter had taught him enough grounds to make a spoon stand up. He drank it slowly in the night in his home on his land, and he was at last completely and entirely himself.